Oh. Give me that. Out of gas life. Bookshelf. Look at that. I have a bookshelf, guys. Just get this. It's where I can actually chill out and lean back in my fucking chair. So, so sorry about leaving you guys in the middle of a story. My sinuses were fucking killing me. But I digress. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, who watch this later, because there's no one that ever comes to my live streams usually, maybe a handful of people, but I usually stream these ahead, mainly because I don't have the tech or the Wi-Fi capabilities of editing and uploading videos. It takes a really long time for a video to upload. Like, if a video is over like 5-10 minutes, it takes for fucking ever. So that kind of sets me back a little bit in terms of making content. The shorts help. The shorts have helped me considerably, getting at least somewhat of a padding for subscribers. But I usually live stream just so I can get my videos up and just so I can actually do what I want to do, which is right now reading books and stories, because I can and because it gives me an excuse to go through all my books. So, but William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe. We're going into the part 2. We're going to finish up the book, or the story, not the book. The book, I'm like right here in the book. We have a lot to go. We have a lot of stories to go through. But to recap, William Wilson is about a man who goes to school, has a guy who attends a school who goes by the exact same name with the exact same birth date. They end up becoming besties, is where we ended off, is when he revealed, like, oh, we're best friends. My guess is we're dealing with, like, a doppelganger type trope, where the other William Wilson, not the narrator, is going to take over the narrator's lifestyle. So, that's my theory for how this story is going to end. But I digress. I don't feel as nasally, thank God. I still have the unfortunate cough. And some spiced cider with cinnamon and clove and a little bit of orange juice. Pro tip, cooking with anything apples, add a little bit of like orange zest or orange juice, and it'll help the citric will essentially help with the flavors of the apples. It makes it taste really fucking good. So, yeah. Is there anything else? Look, he's not on the back of the chair. He got mad at me because I pulled him off the chair. So I think he's understandably a bit miffed with me. Which, you know, is fine. It happens. Cats get angry. Look, it goes really high. I kind of want to see if I can embroider this. Like, embroider around the collar here. And then maybe down the sides. I don't know. Because I don't want it to, like, fuck up this fabric. But at the same time, this fabric seems to be decent. It's not super stretchy, so I think I can embroider it. It might look like shit after, but it's worth a shot. Anyways. So where we specifically left off is the narrator admits that he is became a companion to the person who looks exactly like him, who has the same name. Well, doesn't look exactly like him. He just has the same name and the same birthday. I'm still going for a doppelganger. Still going for a doppelganger. I'm still fucking going for doppelganger. And for those of you who don't know what a doppelganger is, a doppelganger, from what I understand, is a person who basically, well, it's not a person, it's an entity, or a spirit, a folkloric character. Let's just call it a folkloric character. So it's a folkloric character, I think, from Europe, specifically Northern Europe, possibly Ireland and Scotland. I don't know. But if anyone knows the actual, like, folkloric history of the doppelganger, please, in the future, put it in the comments. It just... But doppelgangers are essentially, if you see one, you're probably about to die. Which is probably what's gonna happen, is the other character will kill Wilson, or Wilson's about to die by other means. So, great fun. Now, sorry. I'm stalling. It was no doubt the anomalous state of affairs existing between us which turned all my attacks upon him, and they were many, either open or covert, into the channel of banter or practical joke, giving pain while assuming the aspect of mere fun, rather than his head were by no means uniformly full. Even when my plans were less wittily concocted, for my name's sake had much about him in character of that unassuming and quiet austerity which, while enjoying the poignancy of its own jokes, has no heel of Achilles in itself and absolutely refuses to be laughed at. I could find, indeed, but one venerable point, in that lying in a personal peculiarity, arising perhaps from constitutional disease, which would have been spared by any antagonist less at his wit's end than myself. My rival had a weakness in the buccal or guttural organ, which precluded him from raising his voice at any time, a low whisper. Wilson's retaliations in kind were many, and there was one form of his practical wit that disturbed me beyond measure. How his sagacity first discovered at all that so petty a thing would vex me is a question I never could solve. But having discovered, he habitually practiced the annoyance. I had always felt aversion to my uncourtly patronymic, and its very common, if not Nebian, praenomen. The words were venom in my ears, and when upon the day of my arrival a second William Wilson came also to the academy, I felt angry with him for bearing the name, and doubly disgusted with the name because the stranger bore it, who would be cause of its twofold repetition, who would be constantly in my presence, and whose concerns, in the ordinary routine of the school business, must inevitably, on account of the detestable coincidence, be often confounded with my own. The feeling of vexation thus engendered grew stronger with every circumstance tending to show resemblance, moral or physical, between my rival and myself. I had not then discovered the remarkable fact that we were of the same age, but I saw that we were of the same height, and I perceived that we were even singularly alike in general contour of person and outline of feature. I was galled, too, by the rumor touching a relationship which had grown current in the upper forms. In a word, nothing could more seriously disturb me, although I scrupulously concealed with such disturbance. God, I am slurring. I scrupulously concealed such than any allusion to a similarity of mind, person, or condition existing between us. But in truth, I had no reason to believe that, with the exception of the matter of relationship, and in the case of Wilson himself, the similarity had ever been made a subject of comment or even observed at all by our schoolfellows. That he observed it in all its bearings, and as fixedly as I, was apparent. But that he would discover in such circumstance so fruitful a field of annoyance can only be attributed, as I said before, to his more than ordinary penetration. His cue, which was to perfect an imitation of myself, lay both in words and in actions, and most admirably did he play his part. My dress, it was an easy matter to copy. In general matter were without difficulty appropriated in spite of his constitutional defect. Even my voice did not escape him. My louder tones were of course unattempted, but in the key it was identical. In his singular whisper it grew the very echo of my own. How greatly this most exquisite portraiture harassed me, for it could not justly be termed a caricature. I will not now venture to describe. I had but one consolation, in the fact that the imitation, apparently, was noticed by myself alone, and I had to endure only the knowing and strangely sarcastic smiles of my namesake himself. Satisfied with having produced in my bosom the intended effect, he seemed to chuckle in secret over the sting he had inflicted, and was characteristically disregardful of the public applause which the success of his witty endeavors might have so easily elicited. That the school, indeed, did not feel his design, perceive its accomplishment, and participated in his sneer was, for many anxious months, a riddle I could not resolve. Perhaps the gradation of his copy rendered it not so readily perceptible, or more possibly I owed my security to the masterly air of the copyist, who, disdaining the letter, which in a painting obtuse can see, gave but the full spirit of his original for my visual contemplation and chagrin. I have already more than once spoken of the disgusting air of patronage which he assumed toward me, and of his frequent officious interference with my will. This interference often took the ungracious character of a vice not openly given, but hinted or insinuated. I received it with a repugnance which gave strength as I grew in years. Yet, at this distant day, let me do him the simple justice to acknowledge that I can recall no occasion when the suggestions of my rival were on the side of those errors or follies so usual to his immature age, and seeming inexperience, that his moral sense, at least, if not his general talents and worldly wisdom, was far keener than my own, and that I might today have been a better and thus a happier man had I less frequently rejected the counsels embodied in those meaning whispers which I then but too cordially hated and too bitterly despised. I at length grew restive in the extreme under his distasteful supervision, and daily resented more and more openly what I consider his intolerable arrogance. I have said that, in the first years of our connection as schoolmates, my feelings in regard to him might have been easily ripened into friendship, but in the latter months of my residence at the academy, although the intrusion of his ordinary matter had, beyond doubt, in some measure abated, my sentiments, in nearly similar proportion, partook very much of a positive hatred Upon one occasion he saw this, I think, and afterwards avoided, or made a show of avoiding me. It was about the same period, if I remember right, that in an altercation of violence with him, in which he was more than usually thrown off his guard, and spoke and acted with an openness of manner rather foreign to his nature, I discovered, or fancied I discovered, in his accent, his air, and general appearance, a something which first startled, and then deeply interested me. By bringing to mind dim visions of my earliest infancy, longing memories of a time when memory herself was yet unborn, I cannot better describe the sensation which oppressed me than by saying that could with difficulty shake off the belief of my having been acquainted with a being who stood before me at some epoch very long ago, some point of the past even infinitely remote. The delusion, however, faded rapidly as it came, and I mention it to all but to define the day of the last conversation I there held with my singular namesake. The huge old house with its countless subdivisions had several large chambers communicating with each other, where slept the greater number of the students. There were, however, as must necessarily happen in a building so awkwardly planned, many little nooks or recesses, the odds and ends of the structure. And these the economic ingenuity of Dr. Bransby had also fitted up as dormitories, although being the merest closets, they were capable of accommodating but a single individual. One of these small apartments was occupied by Wilson. One night, about the close of my 5th year at the school, and immediately after the altercation just mentioned, finding everyone wrapped in sleep, I arose from bed and lamp in hand, stole through a wilderness of narrow passages from my own bedroom to that of my rival. I had long been plotting one of those ill-natured pieces of practical wit at his expense in which I had hitherto been so uniformly unsuccessful. It was my intention not to put my scheme in operation, and I resolved to make him feel the whole extent of the malice with which I was imbued. Having reached his closet, I noiselessly entered, leaving the lamp with a shade over it on the outside. I advanced a step and listened to the sound of his tranquil breathing. Assured of his being asleep, I returned, took the light, and with it again approached the bed. Closed curtains were around it, which in the prosecution of my plan I slowly and quietly withdrew. When the bright rays fell vividly upon the sleeper, and my eyes at the same moment upon his countenance, I looked, and a numbness and iciness of feeling instantly pervaded my frame. My breast heaved, my knees tottered, my whole spirit became possessed with an objectless yet intolerable horror. Gasping for breath, I lowered the lamp in still nearer proximity to his face were these, the lineaments of William Wilson. I saw indeed that they were his, but I shook as if with a fit of the ague, and fancying they were not. What was there about them to confound me in this manner? I gazed, while my brain reeled with a multitude of incoherent thoughts. Not thus he appeared, assuredly not thus. In the vivacity of his waking hours, the same name, the same contour of person, the same day of arrival at the academy, and then his dogged and meaningless imitation of my gait, my voice, my habits, and my manner. Was it in truth, within the bounds of human possibility, that what I now saw was the result merely of the habitual practice of this sarcastic imitation? awe-stricken when with a creeping shudder I extinguished the lamp, passed silently from the chamber, and left at once the halls of that old academy, never to enter them again. After a lapse of some months, I spent at home with a mere idleness, I found myself a student at Eton. The brief interval had been sufficient to enfeeble my remembrance of the events at Dr. Bransby's, or at least to effect a material change in the nature of the feelings with which I remembered them. The truth, the tragedy of the drama was no more. I could now find room to doubt the evidence of my senses, and seldom called up the subject at all but with wonder at the extent of human credulity, and a smile at the vivid force of the imagination which I hereditarily possessed. Neither was the species of skepticism likely to be diminished by the character of the life I led at Eton. The vortex of thoughtless folly into which I there so immediately and so recklessly plunged washed away all but the froth of my past hours, engulfed at once every solid or serious impression, and left to memory only the various levities of a former existence. I do not wish, however, to trace the course of my miserable profligacy here, a profligacy which set at defiance the laws while it eluded the vigilance of the institution. 3 years of folly, passed without profit, had but given me rooted habits of vice, and added in a somewhat unusual degree to my bodily stature, when after a week of soulless dissipation, I invited a small party of the most dissolute students to a secret carousel in my chambers. We met at a late hour of the night, for our debaucheries were to be faithfully protracted until morning. The wine flowed freely, and there were not wanting other and perhaps more dangerous seductions, so that the great dawn had already faintly appeared in the east, while our delirious extravagance was at its height. Madly flushed with cards and intoxication, I was in the act of insisting upon a toast of more than wonted profanity, when my attention was suddenly diverted by the violent, although partial, unclosing of the door of the apartment, and by the eager voice of a servant from without. He said that some person, apparently in great haste, demanded to speak with me in the hall. Wildly excited with wine, the unexpected interruption rather delighted than surprised me. I staggered forward at once, and a few steps brought me to the vestibule of the building. In this low and small room there hung no lamp, and now no light at all was admitted save that of the exceedingly feeble dawn, which made its way through the semicircular window. As I put my foot over the threshold, I became aware of the figure of a youth about my own height, inhabited in a white kerseymere morning frock, cut in the novel fashion of the one I myself wore at the moment. This the faint light enabled me to perceive, but the features of his face I could not distinguish. Upon my entering, he strode hurriedly up to me, and seizing me by the arm with a gush of petulant impatience, whispered the words, "William Wilson," in my ear. I grew perfectly sober in an instant. There was that, in the manner of the stranger, and in the tremulous shake of his uplifted finger, as he held it between my eyes and the light, which filled me with unqualified amazement. But it was not this which had so violently moved me. It was the pregnancy of solemn admonition in his singular, low, hissing utterance, and above all, it was the character, the tone, the key of those few, simple, and familiar, yet whispered syllables, which came with 1,000 thronging memories of bygone days, and I struck upon my soul with a shock of galvanic battery. Ere I could recover the use of my senses, he was gone. Although this event failed not of a vivid effect upon my disordered imagination, Yet was it evanescent as vivid. For some weeks indeed I busied myself in earnest inquiry, or was wrapped in a cloud of morbid speculation. I did not pretend to disguise from my perception the identity of the singular individual who thus perseveringly interfered with my affairs and harassed me with his insinuated counsel. But who and what was this Wilson? And whence came he? And what were his purposes? Upon neither of these points could I be satisfied, merely ascertaining in regard to him that a sudden accident in his family had caused his removal from Dr. Bransby's academy on the afternoon of the day in which I myself had eloped. But in a brief period I ceased to think upon the subject, my attention being all absorbed in a contemplated departure for Oxford. Thither I soon went, the incalculating vanity of my parents furnishing me with an outfit and annual establishment which would enable me to indulge at will in the luxury already so dear to my heart, to vie in profuseness of expenditure with the haughtiest peers of the wealthiest earldoms in Great Britain. Excited by such appliances to vice, my constitutional temperament broke forth with redoubled ardor, and I spurned even the common restraints of decency in the mad infatuation of my revels. But it were absurd to pause in the detail of my extravagance. Let it suffice that among spendthrifts I out-Heroded Herod, and that, giving name to a multitude of novel follies, I added no brief appendix to the long catalogue of vices than usual in the most dissolute university of Europe. It could hardly be credited, however, that I had, even here, so utterly fallen from the gentlemanly estate as to seek acquaintance with the vilest arts of the gambler by profession, and having become an adept in this despicable science, to practice it habitually as a means of increasing my already enormous income at the expense of the weak-minded among my fellow collegians. Such, nevertheless, was the fact, and the very enormity of this offense against all manly and honorable sentiment proved beyond doubt the main, if not the sole reason of the impunity with which it was committed. Who indeed, among my most abandoned associates, would not rather have disputed the clearest evidence of his senses than have suspected of such courses the gay, the frank, the generous William Wilson, the noblest and most liberal commoner at Oxford, him, whose follies, said his parasites, were but the follies of youth and unbridled fancy, whose errors but inimitable whim, whose darkest vice but a careless and dashing extravagance. I had been now 2 years successfully busied in this way, when there came to the university a young parvenu nobleman, Glendinning, rich, said report, as Herodes Atticus, his riches too as easily acquired. I soon found him of weak intellect, and of course marked him as a fitting subject for my skill. I frequently engaged him in play, and contrived, with the gambler's usual art, to let him win considerable sums, the more effectually to entangle him in my snares. At length, my schemes being ripe, I met him, with the full intention that this meeting should be final and decisive, at the chambers of a fellow commoner, Mr. Preston, equally intimate with both, but who, to do him justice, entertained not even a remote suspicion of my design. To give to this a better coloring, I had contrived to have assembled a party of some 8 or 10, and was solicitously careful that the introduction of cards should appear accidental, and originate in the proposal my contemplated dupe himself. To be brief upon a vile topic, none of the low finesse was omitted, so customary upon similar occasions that it is a just matter for wonder how any are still found so besotted as to fall his victim. We had protracted our sitting far into the night, and I had at length effected the maneuver of getting Glendinning as my sole antagonist. The game, too, was my favorite écarté. The rest of the company, interested in the extent of our play, had abandoned their own cards and were standing around us as spectators to parvenus, who had been induced by my artifices in the early part of the evening to drink deeply, now shuffled, dealt, or played with a wild nervousness of manner, for which his intoxication, I thought, might partially, but not altogether, account. In a very short period he had become my debtor to a large amount, when, having taken a long draught of port, he did precisely what I had been coolly anticipating. He proposed to double our already extravagant stakes. With a well-feigned show of reluctance, and not until after my repeated refusal had seduced him into some angry words which gave a color of pique to my compliance, did I finally comply. The result, of course, did but prove how entirely the prey was in my toils. In less than an hour he had quadrupled his debt. For some time his countenance had been losing the florid tinge lent it by the wine, but now, to my astonishment, I perceived that it had grown to a pallor truly fearful. I say to my astonishment. Glendinning had been represented to my eager inquiries as immeasurably wealthy, and the sums which he had as yet lost, although in themselves vast, could not, I suppose, very seriously annoy, much less so violently affect him. That he was overcome by the wine just swallowed was the idea which most readily presented itself, and rather, with a view to the preservation of my own character in the eyes of my associates, than from any less interested motive, I was about to insist peremptorily upon a discontinue of the play, when some expressions at my elbow from among the company, and an ejaculation evincing utter despair on the part of Glendinning, gave me to understand that I had effected his total ruin under circumstances which, rendering him an object for the pity of all, should have protected him from the ill offices even of a fiend. What now might have been my conduct is difficult to say. The pitiable condition of my dupe had thrown an air of embarrassed gloom over all, and for some moments a profound silence was maintained, during which I could not help feeling my cheeks tingle with the many burning glances of scorn or reproach cast upon me by the less abandoned of the party. I will even own that an intolerable weight of anxiety was for a brief instant lifted from my bosom by the sudden and extraordinary interruption which ensued. The wide, heavy folding doors of the apartment were all at once thrown open to their full extent, with a vigorous and rushing impetuosity that extinguished, as if by magic, every candle in the room. Their light, in dying, enabled us just to perceive that a stranger had entered about my own height, and closely muffled in a cloak. The darkness, however, was now total, and we could only feel that he was standing in our midst. Before any one of us could recover from the extreme astonishment into which this rudeness had thrown all, we heard the voice of the intruder. "Gentlemen," he said in a low, distinct, and never to be forgotten whisper, which thrilled to the very marrow of my bones. "Gentlemen, I make no apology for this behavior, because in thus behaving, I am but fulfilling a duty. You are, beyond doubt, uninformed of the true character of the person who has tonight won at écarté a large sum of money from Lord Glendinning. I will therefore put you upon an expeditious and decisive plan of obtaining this very necessary information." Please to examine at your leisure the inner linings of the cuff of his left sleeve and and several little packages which may be found in the somewhat capacious pockets of his embroidered morning wrapper. While he spoke, so profound was the stillness that one might have heard a pin drop upon the floor. And ceasing, he departed at once. And as abruptly as he had entered, shall I describe my sensations? Must I say that I felt all the horrors of the damned? Most assuredly, I had a little time given for reflection. Many hands roughly seized me upon the spot, and lights were immediately reprocured. A search ensued. In the lining of my sleeve were found all the court cards essential in écarté, and in the pockets of my wrapper a number of packs, facsimiles of those used at our sittings, with a single exception that mine were of the species called technically allergies. The honors being slightly convex at the end, the lower cards slightly convex at the sides. In this disposition, the dupe, who cuts as customary at the length of the pack, will invariably find that he cuts his antagonist in honor, while the gambler, cutting at the breadth, will certainly cut nothing for his victim, which may count in the records of the game. Any bursts of indignation upon this discovery would have affected me less than the silent contempt or the sarcastic composure with which it was received. "Mr. Wilson," said our host, stooping to remove from beneath his feet an exceedingly luxurious cloak of rare furs. "Mr. Wilson, this is your property." The weather was cold, and upon quitting my own room I had thrown a cloak over my dressing wrapper, putting it off upon reaching the scene of the play. "I presume it is supererogatory to seek here," eyeing the folds of the garment with a bitter smile, "for any further evidence of your skill. Indeed, we have had enough. You will see the necessity, I hope, of quitting Oxford, at all events, of quitting instantly my chambers." Abased, humbled to the dust as I then was, it is probable that I should have resented this scowling language by immediate personal violence, had not my whole attention been at the moment arrested by a fact of the most startling character. The cloak which I had worn was of a rare description of fur. How rare, how extravagantly costly, I shall not venture to say. Its fashion, too, was of my own fantastic invention, for I was fastidious to a certain degree of coxcombry. In matters of this frivolous nature, when therefore Mr. Preston reached me that which he had picked up upon the floor, and near the folding doors of the apartment, it was with an astonishment nearly bordering upon terror that I perceived my own already hanging on my arm, where I had no doubt unwittingly placed it, and that the one presented me was but its exact counterpart in every and even the minutest possible particular. The singular being who had so disastrously exposed me had been muffled, I remembered, in a cloak, and none had been worn at all by any of the members of our party, with the exception of myself. Retaining some presence of mind, I took the one offered me by Preston, placed it, unnoticed, over my own, left the apartment with a resolute scowl of defiance, and next morning, ere dawn of the day, commenced a hurried journey from Oxford to the Continent, in a perfect agony of horror and of shame. I fled in vain. My evil destiny pursued me as if in exultation, and proved, indeed, that the exercise of its mysterious dominion had as yet only begun. Scarcely had I set foot in Paris ere I had fresh evidence of the detestable interest taken by this Wilson in my concerns. Years flew, while I experienced no relief. Villain! At Rome, with how untimely, yet how spectral and officiousness stepped he in between me and my ambition, at Vienna too, at Berlin, and at Moscow, where in truth had I not bitter cause to curse him within my heart. From his inscrutable tyranny did I at length flee, panic-stricken, as from a pestilence into the very ends of the earth. I fled in vain. And again, in secret communion with my own spirit, would I demand the question, who is he? Whence came he? And what are his objects? But no answer was there found. And then I scrutinized with a minute scrutiny the forms and the methods and the leading traits of his impertinent supervision. But even here there was very little upon which to base a conjecture. It was noticeable indeed that in no one of the multiplied instances in which he had of late crossed my path had he so crossed it except to frustrate those schemes or to disturb those actions, which, if fully carried out, might have resulted in bitter mischief. Poor justification this, in truth, for an authority so imperiously assumed. Poor indemnity for natural rights to self-agency so pertinaciously, so insultingly denied. I had also been forced to notice that my tormentor, for a very long period of time, while scrupulously and with miraculous dexterity maintained his whim of an identity of apparel with myself, had so contrived it, in the execution of his varied interference with my will, that I saw not at any moment the features of his face. B. Wilson, why, he might. This, at least, was but the veriest of affections or a folly. Could he, for an instant, have supposed that in my admonisher at Eton, and the destroyer of my honor at Oxford, in him who thwarted my ambition at Rome, my revenge at Paris, my passionate love at Naples, or what he falsely termed my avarice in Egypt, that in this my arch enemy and evil genius, I could fail to recognize the William Wilson of my schoolboy days, the namesake, the companion, the rival, the hated and dreaded rival at Dr. Bransby's? Impossible. But let me hasten to the last eventful scene of the drama. Thus far, I had succumbed supinely to this imperious domination. The sentiment of deep awe with which I habitually regarded the elevated character, the majestic wisdom, the apparent omnipresence and omnipotence of Wilson, added to a feeling of even terror with which certain other traits in his nature and assumptions inspired me, had operated hitherto to impress me with an idea of my own utter weakness and helplessness, and to suggest an implicit, although bitterly reluctant submission to his arbitrary will. But of late days I had given myself up entirely to wine, and its maddening influence upon my hereditary temper rendered me more and more impatient of control. I began to murmur, to hesitate, to resist. Was it only fancy which induced me to believe that, with the increase of my own firmness, that of my tormentor underwent a proportional diminution? Be this as it may, I now began to feel the inspiration of a burning hope, and at length nurtured in my secret thoughts a stern and desperate resolution that I would submit no longer to be enslaved. It was at Rome, during the Carnival of 18, that I attended a masquerade in the Palazzo of the Neapolitan Duke di Broglio. I had indulged more freely than usual in the excesses of the wine table, and now the suffocating atmosphere of the crowded rooms irritated me beyond endurance. The difficulty, too, The difficulty, too, of forcing my way through the mazes of the company contributed not a little to the ruffling of my temper, for I was anxiously seeking, let me not say with what unworthy motive, the young, the gay, the beautiful wife of the aged and doting Di Broglio. With a too unscrupulous confidence, she had previously communicated to me the secret of the costume in which she would be habited. And now, having caught a glimpse of her person, I was hurrying to make my way into her presence. At this moment, I felt a light hand placed upon my shoulder, and I remembered low, damnable whisper within my ear. In an absolute frenzy of wrath, I turned at once upon him, who had thus interrupted me, and seized him violently by the collar. He was attired, as I had expected, in a costume altogether similar to my own, wearing a Spanish cloak of blue velvet, begirt about the waist with a crimson belt sustaining a rapier. A mask of black silk entirely covered his face. "Scoundrel!" I said in a voice husky with rage, while every syllable I uttered seemed a new fuel to my fury. "Scoundrel! Impostor! Accursed villain! You shall not dog me unto death! Follow me, or I stab you where you stand!" And I broke my way from the ballroom into a small antechamber adjoining, dragging him unresistingly with me as I went. Upon entering, I thrust him furiously from me. He staggered against the wall while I closed the door with an oath and commanded him to draw. He hesitated but for an instant, with a slight sigh, drew in silence, and put himself upon his defense. The contest was brief indeed. I was frantic with every species of wild excitement, and I felt within my single arm the energy and power of a multitude. In a few seconds I forced him by sheer strength against the wainscoting, and thus getting him at mercy, plunged my sword with brute ferocity repeatedly through and through his bosom. At that instant, some person tried the latch of the door. I hastened to prevent an intrusion, and then immediately returned to my dying antagonist. But what human language can adequately portray that astonishment, that horror which possessed me at the spectacle then presented to view? The brief moment in which I averted my eyes had been sufficient to produce, apparently, a material change in the arrangements at the upper or farther end of the room. A large mirror, so at first it seemed to me in my confusion, now stood where none had been perceptible before, and as I stepped up to it in extremity of terror, mine own image, but with features all pale and dabbled in blood, advanced to meet me with a feeble and tottering gait. Thus it appeared, I say, but was not. It was my antagonist. It was Wilson, who then stood before me in the agonies of his dissolution. His mask and cloak lay where he had thrown them upon the floor. Not a thread in all his raiment, not a line in all the marked and singular lineaments of his face, which was not even in the most absolute identity mine own. It was Wilson, but he spoke no longer in a whisper, and I could have fancied that I myself was speaking while he said, "You have conquered, and I yield. Yet henceforward art thou also dead. Dead to the world, to heaven, and to hope. In me didst thou exist, and in my death see by this image, which is thine own, how utterly thou hast murdered thyself." Well, I was partially right. I mean, he killed the look-alike. Ended up being a mirror? Oh, that's a pretty picture. Now, the picture, as in the icon, how interesting. Is this? Hmm. Hmm. Right. The next story will be Ligea? I'm gonna have to look up how that's pronounced. To be said a lot in that story, and I don't feel like spending the entirety of it butchering the name. So, that was the remainder of William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe. Once again, excellent story. Yeah. I'll probably do a summarization of my thoughts when I'm done with all the short stories in this book. I also have another Edgar Allan Poe book, collector's book, that might have some different stories that this book doesn't have. So, yeah, yeah. If you like this, like, comment, subscribe, and share. I enjoy doing this. This is actually kind of fun. This is, I think, one of the few shticks I've taken up that I actually kind of like doing, just because it's easily accessible to me and I don't have to do a lot of like techie stuff right now, which I can't really do because I don't have. I have a computer. It's just a piece of shit that I got from Amazon, and it's like refurbished, and it was so cheap, and I kind of regret buying it, but I can't use it. So I can't, there's not a lot of stuff I can do to make content right now. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I can do to make content right now, but it's just a matter of like getting the footage and then possibly editing the footage, which I can't really do because it's just a lot. Anyways, peace out.